Wordsworth in 1800 wrote his famous Preface to Lyrical Ballads. He published Lyrical Ballads in 1798 along with Coleridge, and then republished the collection with additions of his own in 1800. And for the 1800 edition, he wrote a rather long, let's call it, defense of the basic principles behind what he saw as a very experimental book. Even though the book sold fairly well from 1798, there was still a sense that people weren't quite getting what he was up to. So in the preface, he talks about how he's trying to use the language really used by men as opposed to the language of poetic diction. He's also talking about how he's interested in tracking feelings as opposed to thoughts in his poems, in particular feelings of people in a rather agitated state. He also talks about what a poet is. A poet is someone who is open to spontaneous overflows of powerful feelings, and then later on in a more tranquil state can recollect those feelings and with enough distance to where he can write about these feelings in verse. One of the primary claims of the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, 1800, and indeed I should say that there was a third edition of Lyrical Ballads in 1802. He expanded the preface in 1802. So often when you read the preface in a collection of Wordsworth's poetry or anthology, you'll read the 1802 version of the preface because it contains those additions from 1802. But in any case, one of the main claims of the longer preface is that poetry should first and foremost give pleasure. Now, on the surface, this seems to counter what was obviously a primary goal of some of the great poets of the 18th century, someone like, say, Pope. And that was that poetry should have a moral, that poetry should have a didactic quality to it. It should tell us how to live well. So Pope's Essay on Man is a description of what it is to be a human in this world, but also it has a series of recommendations for how to live well in this world. Wordsworth's idea that poetry must give pleasure seems to push against that. However, Wordsworth does have this sense that poetry does have a kind of moral impulse. It's not morality as a set of rules, but morality inspired by a particular way of experiencing the world. Now, what does that mean? So Wordsworth and Coleridge both were very interested in the philosophy of a man named David Hartley, who in 1749 published a book called Observations on the Growth of Man. Coleridge liked Hartley so much that he named his first son Hartley. He named his second son Berkeley after the philosopher George Berkeley. Berkeley didn't live very long. So one of the points that Hartley makes in his Observations on the Growth of Man is that our mind works through association, that when we have a given experience of the world, there are other experiences that arise simultaneously that we tend to associate together. For instance, if as a young child I go spend my weekends at my grandmother's house and my grandmother cooks bacon, and I enjoy being with my grandmother and I enjoy eating her bacon, from then on, when I smell bacon, I will remember my grandmother. She will be associated with that bacon. And when I think about my grandmother, maybe I'll think about bacon. The most famous moment of this sort of thinking occurs in Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, where the speaker, the novelist, the narrator, based on Proust, eats the Madeleine, the little sweet, and it reminds him of his childhood in rural France, and that becomes the beginning of the entire novel. So Wordsworth in his preface says, look, the purpose behind these poems is to study how people, in particular rural people, associate ideas in a state of excitement. And in studying the way the mind associates in a state of excitement, one might be able to think about how all minds work. And this could lead to a way perhaps of writing poetry that would form new associations that would invite readers to partake more enthusiastically of the natural world. Wordsworth is very clear about that. He says that basically feelings are what shape us into who we are. Think about the feelings you had as a child. Think about strong feelings right now. Feelings come first, but then our reason, in a way, is a representative of these feelings. But then you can change, if you will, the way you think about the world, your reason, and that can open you up to fresh feelings. Here's what Wordsworth says. He says, for our continued influxes of feeling are modified and directed by our thoughts, which are indeed the representatives of all of our past feelings. So thoughts represent past feelings. And as by contemplating the relation of these general representatives to each other, we discover what is really important to men. So by repetition and continuance of this act, our feelings will be connected with important subjects, till at length, if we be originally possessed by much sensibility, such habits of mind will be produced that, by obeying blindly and mechanically the impulses of those habits, we shall describe objects and utter sentiments of such a nature and in such connection with each other that the understanding of the being to whom we address ourselves, if he be in a healthful state of association, must necessarily be in some degree enlightened and his affections ameliorated. What's Wordsworth saying? He's saying that the poet can write poems that present the rural world in an interesting way, that present the rural world in a positive way. And as we read those poems, we will form positive associations with the subjects of those poems. We say, if we live in the city, we'll suddenly think, wow, the rural world is really interesting and beautiful. And people who live in this rural world are interesting and beautiful. And if we read those poems enough, new habits of perception will emerge in our minds. We will have new associations. The rural world now is interesting. And these new associations will lead to new feelings. I might go visit the rural world from London and be open to what is interesting about that world. And that will create new experiences. And those new experiences will create new thoughts. And my world will be improved. So if there is a moral impulse in Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, and indeed in all of his poems, it is that the pleasure we get from reading these poems about rural life, this pleasure will encourage fresh associations. And these fresh associations will open us to new experiences of the rural world. And those new experiences of the rural world will make us feel more alive, more vital, more connected. Remember, Wordsworth says in the preface that urban life is a life of overstimulation, to the point where urban dwellers are so overstimulated that they can't really feel anything anymore. They're numb. He says that urban life is one of savage torpor, meaning a kind of lassitude that's so thorough that it leads to a kind of irritability, frustration, a kind of savagery. Very strong indictment of the urban world. Now, Wordsworth did enjoy his London experiences, but at the same time, he definitely in his poetry wanted to say that if I can create through my verse new habits in my readers that open them to the grandeur of the rural world, I will not only have given them pleasure, but also will have made their lives better. That's the moral quality. Not didactic, not a set of codes, but an intensification of experience that makes life feel more riveting, electric, worth valuing, worth loving, worth caring for.